by facts and driven by truth. Broadcasting live from beautiful British Columbia, it's RoadKill Radio.
Welcome to RoadKill Radio. I'm Ron Gray, and with me in the studio is Kari Simpson. And with us online is Ontario Member of Parliament Stephen Woodworth. Stephen, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. Hi.
Thanks. Thank you for being with us today. Stephen, you've introduced a private member's bill which relates to a 400-year-old law about babies. Do you want to give us
a 400-year-old law, and probably the most controversial subject matter known on this earth?
It's controversial in one sense, but in another sense, it's not really controversial. And I don't mind giving you a bit of explanation if we have the time.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay. First of all, the law is currently found in the Criminal Code, Section 223, subparagraph 1. And it's quite astonishing when you see it. It's a written down definition of human being. And it says that a child becomes a human being when the child has fully proceeded in a living state from the body of the mother. So in Canada, and by the way, those are almost exactly the words of the section. So in Canada, you are a child before you're a human being. And in fact, in Canada, you are not a human being until your little toe pops out of the birth canal. This law is intended to be for the criminal code, but actually courts have made it apply to things across the board. So, for example, the courts have said that children before complete birth are not entitled to any of the rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms because of this law. It was first written down, as nearly as I could find, in 1644, and it was from judge-made law at that time, and then, of course, when Canada was created in 1867, we incorporated a lot of British common law into our laws, and this was one of them. It may have made sense back in the days when leeches and bloodletting were standard medical practice, but the question that I'm asking is whether it makes sense, medical sense, in the 21st century. So I brought a motion to simply ask Parliament to study the evidence about whether or not this law is accurate and truthful and honest. I don't think it is. I think a child becomes a human being well before the moment of complete birth. I don't think that there is a magical transformation when the little toe pops out the birth canal that changes a child from a non-human to a human.
Well, MP Stephen Woodworth, there is, though, some legal precedent that a child in utero can, for example, have inheritance rights of some kind. Isn't that so?
Only if born alive.
Only. Okay.
Okay, but even that raises the issue, because when I looked very closely at this definition, I mean, this definition is problematic for a number of reasons. Very problematic from the point that you've raised in your private member's bill, MP Woodworth. We did a series here on RoadKill Radio with a number of outspoken MPs and senators about what needs to be done here, because exactly what you have stated, the technology gives us a whole nother vantage point of how we are to be looking at human life. To rely on the understanding, as you say, and the principles and practices of a 400-year-old statute, it should be very concerning. I mean, it almost goes to the fact that, you know, if a child's not a human being, we're back in the ages where women weren't really persons either.
Well, and also, you referred to a statute, but it isn't. Stephen, you said this is judge-made law, right?
Well, it was originally judge-made law, but then it was incorporated into our statute law,
okay.
And Canada was created in 1867.
Okay.
So those judges back in the 17th century, of course, they had no way of knowing what was going on with a child until the child actually did appear and was alive at birth. But today it's quite correct to say that you can even have surgery on a child before the child is born. You can detect the functioning of the cerebral cortex a number of weeks before the child is born. a child has his or her own unique blood type, quite separate and independent from the blood type of the mother. So there's a whole wealth of medical evidence which should, in any rational way, cause us to re-examine the concept that's in Section 223.1 and look at the definition of human being. And you know what? It's so very important to do that because if you agree with me that a child is a human being 5 hours before birth as much as 5 hours after birth, then you have to ask yourself, should in Canada in the 21st century, should we ever accept any law that says some human beings are not human beings? That strikes at the very legitimacy of our legal system.
Now,
and if you do that, by the way, you have to ask yourself, if you can say that some children are not human beings, who's next?
well,
If there was time, I would tell you about an answer to the question of who's next that was published just about a month or two ago. Want me to talk about that?
sure.
Yeah,
Now you got me curious, and that's a dangerous thing for Kari to be left in a state of curiosity. So,
Let's hear
yes,
it.
please do.
By coincidence, not more than 2 or 3 weeks after I filed my motion in Parliament, a couple of European professors published an article in the Journal of Medical Ethics Online. And the title of the article was "After Birth Abortion: Should the Baby Live?" And the proposition they put is really quite logical. If you accept their first premise that it's acceptable to decree by law that some human beings are not human, if you accept that premise, then what they say is there is no difference between a child before birth and a newborn infant. And since we've decreed that a child before birth is not a human person, therefore we can decree that a newborn infant is not a human person. And they then go on to say that any reason that we use to justify abortion of a child before birth should apply equally to taking the life of the newborn infant.
Well, it's interesting. The psychology of what you are talking about there was front and center concerning discussions we had here on RoadKill Radio concerning the murder of Katrina Effort's baby.
And that's very similar.
And where do we start in indoctrinating this notion that human life has no value? I look at this generation of kids nowadays where they're told that, pregnancy is a problem, babies are a problem. The best way you deal with the problem is to kill the baby. Okay. Or I guess we better use the proper term child because we have law that defines child here. Then when this problem arises and is born, what's in the mind of the Katrina Efforts of this world? You strangle the baby and you toss it over the neighbor's fence because it has no value, it has no life, it has no significance of importance, and after all, it is a problem.
But I really think it's important to understand that this has to do with more than just children or babies or fetuses or infants. Because the question is whether or not we can ever legitimately decree that any human being is not human. And if we can do it for children before birth, then we can do it for newborn infants, and we can do it for people who have been in a coma for 60 days or longer, or we can do it for adults who have Down syndrome. We can do it for anybody we want if we admit in the first place that it's legitimate to decree that any human being is not a human being. So my motion challenges that notion, that challenges the whole idea that a law can ever be legitimate that says some human beings are not human.
Your motion, if it's successful in Parliament, is going to have a distinct impact on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Well, it's a two-part process, because actually my motion only requires a study of the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Requires a committee to be set up to receive evidence on when a child becomes a human being. It does not ask the committee to reach any conclusion, but merely to report that evidence back to Parliament.
Okay, so now just let me stop you there, Stephen. So if your private member's bill is adopted and passed, there will be a committee that will be formed, and that committee will receive evidence. So that means experts are going to come and testify?
Yes, that's what the motion requires. Now, it'll be up to the committee how seriously they devote themselves to that, but if they do it honestly and conscientiously, experts will come to the committee and provide evidence, descriptive evidence about the development of a child before birth, and then the committee will report back to Parliament on what that evidence says and what are the options available to Parliament to fix the problem created by our present definition of human being.
Okay.
Parliament can take it or leave it at that point. I hope they'll take it up, but at that point, my motion has done its job.
Now, the committee transcripts are available for people. So concerned Canadians are going to be able to see, if they're interested in what's transpired before this committee, what kind of evidence is presented. You're talking to cynical British Columbians here who have lost a lot of faith in our elected officials as far as being honest with us about things. So this information now will special interest groups be allowed to also give evidence or testify before this committee? Will people who have had this, factor contributed to their lives be able to also present evidence? Is there any limits to the committee's mandate or scope that is imposed on by your members' bill?
The only limit is that the committee will have 10 months to do the study and report back.
Okay.
But beyond that, the committee will be its own master and will decide what evidence to hear. And I just have to place my trust in their good work ethic that they will hear from the relevant disciplines.
Who decides on the makeup of the committee, Stephen?
Well, the leadership of the parties does.
Okay. So the Prime Minister is going to sit down and decide who's going to preside over these hearings.
Well, the Prime Minister and the leader of the NDP and the leader of the Liberal Party, those are the official parties in Parliament, and they will each be able to nominate some members to the committee.
Wow, that's going to be an interesting exercise. I'll be most interested in watching that one.
The structure of your bill reminds me of Peter Kreeft's book, The Unaborted Socrates, where a journalist is interviewing the ancient philosopher out in front of an abortion mill, and they're trying to identify whether the object of the procedure is actually a human being. And Socrates asks, well, is it a carrot? Is it a rabbit? If both of its parents are human, doesn't that make it human? That's kind of where your bill points us, I think.
Well, in the end, I will leave those conclusions for after the evidence has been received.
Yes.
Now, Stephen, this private members bill, which I think is way past due. I mean, certainly the information we've had from the medical community, the science community, all tells us a very different story about the formation of human life. We can't ignore the evidence any longer. Well, I suppose some people choose to ignore it, but civil-minded Canadians will not ignore this. I think what struck me most concerning over our willingness here on RoadKill Radio to discuss this in a civil, rationalized, common sense way has been the lack of information Canadians truly have in their understanding of the issues around abortion and those kinds of things, and the fact that a child in the womb can be murdered basically right up into the point of delivery. There's this assumption that there's laws to protect babies and, it has to happen if you're going to terminate within the first few weeks. That's not the case. Why do you think Canadians lack this insight and understanding about this very significant and important part of our nation? Because this goes right to the very heart of what it is to be a Canadian. It goes to the definition of what we are as a nation.
I agree. Although I can give you some answers, some conclusions that I've reached, and one of them is that the rhetoric on these issues has been too overheated. And if you want to have a discussion with somebody, you can't go at it with unpleasant language and imagery. As much as that might be the truth, there are some truths that are very hard, and people recoil from them. They turn away from them. So one of the things that I'm trying to encourage people to do, for example, is not to use a word like murder. You know, it may be so that, and it may be an honestly held opinion and a truthful one, but people will sometimes react by recoiling from overheated rhetoric. I prefer to talk about the medical evidence and about the legal principles involved, about principles of human rights, and in that way make the conversation more acceptable and appealing to people. But there is another reason why I think people are ill-informed, and that's because Canada is pretty much alone in the world on this. There are, with the exception of a few American states, there are only 3 other countries that I'm aware of that share Canada's complete disregard for the human rights of children before birth. And those are North Korea, the People's Republic of China, and Vietnam, 3 non-democratic tyrannies that don't respect human rights. So I think that Canadians, knowing that most of the world does provide at least some recognition for the rights of children before birth, just naturally assume that Canada does also. And 80% of Canadians, in fact, think that we have a law which does protect children at least in the 3rd trimester of development before birth. And they're often surprised when I tell them, no, we don't. We have a law that, in fact, strips children of all human rights until the moment of complete birth.
Did you have any difficulty within your own party in bringing this private member's bill forward?
Well, you know, we have 165 members of Parliament in my party, and in that number of members of Parliament, there are obviously going to be some who agree with me and some who don't agree with me, and they're all my friends, so it's always difficult to disagree with friends. But there are people in my party who don't agree with me, and to the degree that I don't like to disagree with my friends, that's a difficulty. But on the other hand, we're engaged in politics because we all have different opinions and values and ideals. And so, really, in another sense, I don't mind when people disagree with me as long as they do it in a nice way.
Now, but what is there to disagree on? Because the language of your bill is simply seeking truth. Let's just ask the question, unless we're afraid of the answer.
Yeah, well, actually, that's an excellent question, and I can tell you what bothers most members of Parliament who don't agree with me on this, and it's that they're worried that Canadians won't be receptive to it. They're worried because there's a minority of about 20% of Canadians who can be very insulting and rude and mean, I guess, to those who are pursuing this truth. And they say to themselves, what electoral advantage is there in it for me to raise this issue when I know I'm going to be abused for it? I'm not sure that Canadians will agree. There's lots of polling evidence out there to say that many Canadians, about 58 or 60%, don't want to reopen the abortion issue. Well, what people don't understand is the reason they don't want to reopen it is because they think we already have a law that does provide some protection for children.
Well, and you know what, Stephen, this is about leadership, and I think 88% of Canadians appreciate and support people who demonstrate true leadership. We don't have enough of that. The eloquence of truth and the eloquence of your argument and the facts, you know, nobody should be disagreeing with this. As a civilized nation, and one we would hope it operates from an informed civil sense of things, we should be embracing this movement. We should be embracing your leadership.
Well, I don't want to be too oversimplifying, because there is actually another deeper issue, and I'd like to say 2 things, if I may, if there's time yet.
Yep.
One is that unfortunately there are people out there for whom the ends justify the means, so that for some people it doesn't matter whether or not a child is a human being before birth. If it interferes with women's rights to end their pregnancies, then the end human being.
But Stephen, even on that, from a woman, then let's be honest about the debate and the discussion. Let's not fool ourselves into this false sense of complacency about what we're doing. If I think if years ago we had done that, a number of my friends wouldn't be in the depressive state they are now, recognizing that they, did away with a human life, right?
Right. I entirely agree with you. That is the right answer to it. But it's still, for those of us who don't think that way, who don't believe that ends justify means, it's hard to wrap your head around it. The other thing that I want to say, though, is that I'd be remiss if I didn't ask your listeners to make sure that they contact every member of Parliament and let them know how they feel about my motion. Let them know that, as you put it, it is a pretty inarguable point.
Yes.
Should be supported.
I think I'd like to underscore that, regardless of what, you may know what your MP's opinion is at this point. That's not the important thing. The important thing is that your MP learns what your opinion is.
Right.
The citizens need to be heard. You having identified the some of the electoral disadvantages in raising this question, I want to personally thank you for having had the courage to do what you have done. It opens a significant and important door, which is the door to truth. The examination of the facts cannot, in the end, hurt anyone.
Exactly.
Well, and as Stephen raised the issue, Canada is recognized as a leader in the human rights movement. We are the ones that have foisted, this concept upon many other nations, and yet we have this terrible scar.
Yeah, we've just been celebrating our Charter of Rights and Freedoms as a world leader in the field, and you're right, we have this scar.
Okay, Stephen, I want to ask this question because I think this is significant. So many people I talk to, and I get to talk to a lot of people, say, what's the point, Kari? What's the point? Are you telling me that their voices, their calls, regardless of whether they're adopted or accepted by their MPs, will make a difference?
Well, let me say that there is no other way. Unless a member of Parliament believes that his or her constituents support a particular action that might be difficult, the member of Parliament will shy away from it. So the only avenue that we have for change in this area is to make certain that members of Parliament are aware of the great support that I think is out there for the truth and for just law in this respect.
Now,
if they don't do that, you can be sure nothing will change.
I think we should add to that there are different levels of expression of citizen opinion.
Well, and I'm glad you raised that because there are petitions going around, are there not?
Yes,
Okay.
There are petitions. You can find links from my website. My website's www.stephenwithaph.woodworth.ca. There's another good one at www.notyetborn.wordpress.com. And there are petitions, there are sample letters. You can make an appointment to meet with your member of Parliament in person. Bring a group of friends, and all of that will make an impact.
That was where I wanted to go next, is that the petition is okay. A personally written letter, and by the way, you don't have to put a stamp on a letter to your member of Parliament. A personally written letter is better. A visit to your MP at his or her constituency office is even better. And your suggestion that you get a group of friends together.
But that's consistent with the RoadKill radio way. You plus 5 of your best, nearest, and dearest, right? Yeah. Take all 5 voices with you.
Yeah.
Stephen Woodworth, thank you so much for your actions on this important matter, for bringing a reality that needs to be dealt with, that is timely. The science, the medical evidence deserves to be examined and incorporated into the governance of this nation and the protection of all human life.
Well, you're very welcome. I just am conscious that there's construction going on in the office next to mine. I hope that hasn't disrupted our conversation.
You have been compelling our total focus. Nothing could divert us. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Stephen.
Have a great day.
You too.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Good night. important, Ron Gray. When I started following what was going on here, I was first aghast to find out that we were basing our laws on notions dating back 400 years. Shame on us. But more shame on us is that this medical and science has been available for a long time.
Yeah.
And it's sure taken a heck of a long time to at least start the discussion on this.
And the statistic that 80% of Canadians think there is some protection for a preborn child.
I thought it was 90%.
When there is none.
Yeah.
No protection at all.
No.
Not since 1988.
Yeah, things have to change. We have to come into the now times.
Understanding of the truth will change things. So the knowledge that no law exists regarding the life of a preborn child, that's step one in the truth being understood. Then understanding what the preborn child is. Yeah. That it is part of the human family.
Well, and
the evidence will bring that out.
Well, and Ron, what I always harp on too, and I come back to this, is that life should be precious to every Canadian. And that knowledge,
here.
We take care of each other. We have, our country is dedicated to helping people, and yet we have this evil thing that goes on the other side, but we'll just hush about it. We'll kill our children. We'll kill our old people. Do you know how many tax dollars are being spent in the courts because no leadership in Canada will say human life has a value and we're not going to debate it anymore? We have court cases going on right now about euthanasia, whether it's a medical necessity, nothing but making lawyers rich and judges employed people, and harming what we are as Canadians, what it is to be a Canadian, to value life, protect life, and take care of one another.
And if these things are done with our tax dollars, then we are complicit, and we need to stand up and say, stop.
I don't do complicit. And neither should you. I know you don't. Good night, everybody. I'm Kari Simpson.
I'm Ron Gray.
You've been listening to RoadKill Radio. Join us again next week for another trip down the superhighway of information, fact, and truth.